On the 5th of April, 1976, Howard Hughes died on a chartered jet over Texas. He weighed about 90 pounds, and the FBI had to use fingerprints to confirm the body was his. He had been the richest man in America, worth about $2.5 billion. But he left behind no will, no trust, no heir, and no plan for any of it. What followed took 34 years. About 22 cousins, most of whom had met him once or never, split an empire that was sold off piece by piece. Howard Hughes was 18 years old when his father died in Houston in 1924 and left him 75% of the Hughes Tool Company. The business ran on a single patent, a rotary drill bit that could cut through rock no competing tool could reach, and the oil fields of Texas and Louisiana paid whatever Hughes tool demanded. It was a cash machine. The drill bit did not require a sales force or a marketing campaign. The oil men needed it, and they came to Houston to get it, and they paid the price on the tag. Within months of his father's death, the teenager used his inheritance to take sole control of the entire operation. He was orphaned and a millionaire at 18, answering to no partner, no board, and no one alive. That condition would hold for the rest of his life. For the next 52 years, every enterprise Howard Hughes touched would run under a single rule. He decided everything, and everyone else carried out his orders. He left Houston for Hollywood and began producing motion pictures, spending money on a scale the studio system had never seen from a private individual. Advice was not something he sought, and delegation was not something he practiced. Instead, he designed and flew aircraft himself. But he had no interest in fame for its own sake. What interested him was control, and by the early 1960s, the scope of what he controlled was staggering. He was 2 decades from his worst isolation, and nothing about that moment suggested the disappearance that was coming. The Hughes Aircraft Company, which he had founded to build experimental planes, grew into one of the largest companies in the country, and then he bought Trans World Airlines. TWA became his instrument for dominating commercial aviation, and he ran it the way he ran every other enterprise he owned, alone, choosing the routes, the schedules, the aircraft, the paint on the fuselage. On the 3rd of May, 1966, a federal court forced him to divest his TWA stake. He sold 6.5 million shares in about 20 minutes for $546 million, a profit of $452 million on a single afternoon's work. That sale was not the fortune. That was one holding inside an empire that reached from the oil fields of East Texas to the aircraft plants of Los Angeles. To understand the scale of the empire he was building, consider what a single afternoon's work was worth. The profit Hughes made on the TWA sale, $452 million, would have been enough on its own to make him one of the wealthiest men in the country. But that was one holding. The tool company still produced cash from the oil fields. The aircraft company was worth billions. And he was about to add an entire city to the list. On Thanksgiving Day of 1966, Howard Hughes came to Las Vegas. He arrived by private railroad car and was carried on a stretcher to the penthouse floor of the Desert Inn. He did not come back down. The windows of the suite were sealed, every pane of glass covered with blackout material, and his contact with the outside world was reduced to a method that would have seemed unthinkable for a man of his reach. He communicated through handwritten memos, slid under the door to a small circle of male aides, who stood in the hallway and relayed his instructions by telephone to the executives running his companies across the country. His routines were fixed and unvarying. The conditions of the room never allowed to change. No visitors were permitted. No telephone calls were accepted from anyone outside a handful of trusted voices. A man worth billions of dollars, directing companies across the country through scraps of paper pushed under a door, had sealed himself into a single room in the middle of the Las Vegas Strip. Nobody in the city ever saw his face. When the management of the Desert Inn told Hughes they needed the penthouse back for the New Year's high rollers, he did not negotiate. He bought the hotel, then he bought the Sands, then the Frontier, the Castaways, the Silver Slipper, and the Landmark. More than $300 million in Las Vegas real estate in about 3 years, at a pace that averaged more than $175,000 a day, every transaction conducted through intermediaries because the buyer never left his room. He became one of the largest private landowners in Nevada, the single most important figure in the Las Vegas economy, and not one person in the state had looked him in the face while a single deed was signed. By the spring of 1976, this was what Howard Hughes had built. The tool company still throwing off cash from the oil fields, an aircraft company worth billions, 6 casinos on the Strip, vast tracts of undeveloped desert land, and one of the most recognized names in the country. All of it ran through one man. There was no partner and no board with the power to override him. No succession plan had been drawn. No trust protected the assets from lawsuits or taxes. Not one document anywhere on earth named a person to take charge or said what should happen to any of it when he was no longer alive to give the orders. The empire was held together by one man and by nothing else. He died at about 1:27 in the afternoon aboard a private jet chartered from Acapulco to Methodist Hospital in Houston. In the final years, he had been moved from one sealed room to another, carried on a stretcher from Las Vegas to the Bahamas, to Nicaragua, to Vancouver, to London, and at last to a hotel suite overlooking Acapulco Bay. Each room was the same as the one before. Blacked out windows, the same aides, the same isolation, the same handwritten memos addressed to men who were managing billions of dollars on the word of a man they could hear coughing through the door. He had stood 6'4" in the years when the cameras found him. The body that arrived at the Houston morgue weighed about 90 pounds. The investigative journalists Donald Barlett and James Steele, who spent years documenting the final chapter of his life, reported that the autopsy x-rays revealed 5 broken-off hypodermic needles still embedded in his arms. His body arrived under the name John T. Conover, a pseudonym his staff had used for years to keep his movements hidden from the press, from the public, and from anyone who might have intervened. The man who had built the largest private fortune in the country was beyond recognition at the hour of his death. The cause of death was kidney failure. He was 70 years old, with no wife, no children, no surviving parents, and no siblings. The man who had controlled the largest private fortune in the country for half a century left behind no will and no instructions of any kind for what should happen to any of it. This was not an oversight born of incapacity, and it was not the result of a mind too far gone to understand what was at stake. Hughes had shown considerable legal sophistication when the situation required it. He had created the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in 1953, a structure complex enough to hold ownership of an entire aircraft company and protect it from the tax obligations that would have consumed it. In 1966, he had managed the forced sale of millions of airline shares without leaving a hotel room. Through intermediaries he communicated with by memo alone, he had directed the purchase of 6 casinos across Las Vegas. Whatever his isolation had done to his mind in the final decade, and the evidence from the hotel rooms suggests it had done a great deal, the failure to write a will had started long before the worst of the decline. He had the resources to do it, and the lawyers. He had the example of his own father, who had died in 1924, leaving his estate to a teenager with no guidance and no preparation. And still Hughes did not do it. The one lesson his father's death should have taught him, he refused to learn. And here's the detail that makes the failure hardest to fathom. At 19 years old, with the shock of his father's death still raw, Howard Hughes had drafted a will. In that document, he called for the creation of a medical research institute, the very institution he would go on to build 3 decades later. The intention was on the page. The pen was in his hand. He knew what he wanted to do with the money, and he wrote it down. But the draft was never executed. It was never signed before the witnesses the law required, never filed with any court, never given the legal weight that would have made it binding. It stayed in a drawer, an artifact of a 19-year-old's grief, while the man who wrote it lived another 51 years and never produced a valid will to replace it. He ran an aircraft company and bought an airline. Through intermediaries, he purchased 6 casinos and controlled them without leaving a hotel room. And in all that time, surrounded by lawyers, surrounded by advisors, surrounded by the evidence of what happens when a wealthy man dies without a plan, Howard Hughes never brought himself to sign one page. What any adult in the country can do in a single afternoon, the most controlling man in America did not do in 51 years. The legal condition that resulted had a precise name. Intestate. It meant that the law, not the dead, would decide where the fortune went. When a person dies intestate, the state steps in and distributes the estate according to a fixed formula, without regard for the dead person's wishes, relationships, or intentions. The formula looks first for a spouse, then for children, then for parents, then for siblings. When none of those exist, it reaches further. Under the intestacy laws that governed a man who died without a will, the fortune of Howard Hughes passed to the nearest living relatives the law could find. Hughes had no close relatives left. His parents were dead, he had no siblings, and he had no children. The nearest heirs the statute could reach were cousins, distant branches of the Hughes and Gano families, scattered across the country, people connected to him by nothing more than shared ancestry. Most of them had met Howard Hughes once in their lives, or never at all. The largest private fortune in America was sitting in the open, with no legal instrument protecting it, no named heir standing ready to claim it, and no barrier against the jurisdiction of every state that could make a case for a piece of it. It was exposed, and the man who could have shielded it was dead. The moment that fact became known, the largest inheritance fight in American history began. Within weeks of his death, the claimants started to appear. They came from every direction and from every kind of story: wives, sons, daughters, first cousins, second cousins, cousins 5 times removed. People who said Hughes had promised them money in a handshake, in a letter, on a napkin in a restaurant, over a telephone line no one else had been listening to. Strangers who claimed to be his secret children. Others who claimed to be his secret spouses. An actress named Terry Moore came forward claiming that she and Hughes had been married in a secret ceremony aboard a yacht in 1949. She never produced proof of the marriage. The cousins would acknowledge her claim in a 1983 settlement for an undisclosed sum, though no court ever confirmed the ceremony itself. She was one of hundreds, and the stories kept on coming. The total count of claimants passed 400. Dozens of purported wills surfaced, each claiming to be the genuine last testament of Howard Hughes, each naming a different set of beneficiaries, and not one bearing a signature that could be verified. Probate proceedings were opened at the same time in 3 cities: Houston, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles, because no one could establish where Hughes had been living at the time of his death. A man who had spent the last full decade of his life moving between sealed rooms on 3 continents had no fixed address that anyone could agree on, and every state with a plausible claim to his residency wanted a share of the estate tax. By the end of 1976, at least 200 lawyers were involved in some part of the case. The legal fees were mounting before a single dollar of the fortune had been distributed, and no resolution was in sight. The estate of the most private man in America had become the most public legal spectacle in the country. And then the most brazen claim of all arrived. In the spring of 1976, an envelope was left at the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City. No one saw who delivered it. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, dated the 19th of March, 1968, purporting to be the last will and testament of Howard Hughes. The document divided the fortune among several beneficiaries, including the Boy Scouts of America, a number of universities, and the church itself. But one name drew more attention than all the others combined. The will left about 1/16 of the entire fortune, about $156 million, to a gas station attendant in Willard, Utah, named Melvin Dumar. Dumar's story was that he had once picked up a disheveled stranger wandering in the Nevada desert and driven the man to Las Vegas, and that the stranger had turned out to be Howard Hughes. The story was difficult to credit on its face, and the evidence made it impossible to sustain. The will named as its executor Noah Dietrich, a former Hughes executive whom Hughes had fired 12 years before the document was dated. Handwriting expert Spencer Otis examined the pages and called them a forgery. And the detail that finished Dumar was physical. His fingerprints were found on the envelope that had delivered the will to Salt Lake City. His fingerprints were also found on a library copy of a book about how to forge the handwriting of Howard Hughes, a book written by Clifford Irving, who had been convicted of fabricating an entire autobiography of Hughes just 4 years earlier. A forger had used the manual of a convicted forger. On the 8th of June, 1978, after a trial lasting 7 months, a jury in Las Vegas ruled the will a forgery, and Melvin Dumar's claim to $156 million disappeared with it. The Mormon will was the most vivid chapter of the inheritance war, but it was never the most important one. What mattered was not whether a gas station attendant had forged a document. What mattered was who, among the hundreds of people claiming the fortune of Howard Hughes, had a legal right to any of it. In 1981, the Harris County Probate Court in Houston delivered the answer, Under Texas intestacy law, the fortune of Howard Hughes belonged to his nearest living relatives by blood. The court identified about 22 of them, scattered across the country and connected to one another by nothing more than the fact that they shared ancestors with the dead man. 16 heirs on the maternal side, descended from the Gano family, received 71.5% of the estate. 5 heirs on the paternal side, carrying the Hughes name, divided the rest. These were not people Howard Hughes had chosen. They were not people he had known or written to or invited into any part of his life. Several had met him once. Others had never met him at all. They were his heirs because a statute written for people who failed to make a will said they were, and for no other reason. The most deliberate man in American business had left the single most important decision of his financial life to a default rule he had never read. The court had answered the question of who inherited, but inheriting a fortune and holding one are different things, and the heirs of Howard Hughes were about to learn just how different. The fortune they had been handed was not a bank account. It was a constellation of operating companies, government contracts, casino licenses, undeveloped land, and legal disputes stretching across 3 states. It required daily management, decisions on every front, and leadership of a kind none of them had ever been asked to provide. And the person who would have to provide all of that was a man who had never asked for the job and had no preparation for it. His name was William Lummis. He was a first cousin of Howard Hughes, a Houston attorney who had spent his career in the law, connected to the Hughes family by the accident of a shared grandparent, and he had seen his famous cousin alive on 2 occasions in his entire life. The first time, Lummis was a small child and retained no clear memory of the visit. The second time, he was 9 years old. What they talked about, if they talked at all, left no impression. He grew up in Houston, studied law, built a career of his own, and lived his adult life with no connection to the Hughes empire and no expectation that any connection would ever be asked of him. 40 years after that second childhood visit, a Houston probate court named William Lummis, the administrator of the Howard Hughes estate, and the chairman and chief executive officer of Summa Corporation, the holding company through which Hughes had controlled his casinos, his mining claims, his real estate, and the sprawl of commercial interests that made up the portion of the empire outside the medical institute. Lummis had never set foot inside any of those operations. He had never reviewed their books, never met the executives who managed them, and never once spoken to Howard Hughes about the business or about anything at all since he was 9 years old. The court placed him at the head of a $2 billion enterprise because the law required someone to stand in the dead man's place, and because the dead man had never named anyone to stand there for him. The richest man in America had left his empire to a man who shared his blood and nothing else. Not because Lummis was qualified, or willing, or chosen, because the law said he was next in line and Hughes had never named anyone else. That was the mechanism at the heart of the story, the thing that turned a $2.5 billion fortune into a 34-year dismantling, and it operated in 4 parts. No will meant no direction. The fortune could not go where Hughes might have wanted it to go because he had never said where he wanted it to go. Every dollar he owned passed according to a default statute, a rule written for people who die without instructions, and it sent the money to blood relatives he had never bothered to contact or to know. The absence of a trust meant no protection. A trust would have placed the assets inside a legal structure with its own rules, its own governance, and its own defenses against taxation and litigation. Hughes had none. The fortune sat in the open, exposed to the tax claims of every state that could assert jurisdiction, and to the legal claims of every person who could hire an attorney. There was no barrier of any kind between the money and the crowd of hands reaching for it. Without a succession plan, there was no continuity. The companies Hughes had spent a lifetime building had no one trained to run them, no one positioned to take over, no one who understood the operations from the inside. Those who knew how the businesses worked were employees, not owners, and they had no authority to make the decisions an owner makes. Selling was the option that remained, and there was no other. And without any family relationship, there was no stewardship. The cousins who inherited the estate had not built any of it and did not understand how the companies worked or why they had been created. There was no memory of the man behind the money and no attachment to the work he had done. The heirs collected a check because a check was all the situation allowed them to collect. They had no reason to fight for the companies, and so the companies were sold, and the money was divided, and the empire of Howard Hughes became a line item on a probate ledger. The tax war showed what the absence of structure cost in the plainest terms available. 3 states claimed Howard Hughes as their legal resident at the time of his death, and each one had a case it could argue. Texas said he had never abandoned his Houston domicile, that his legal roots remained in the city where his father had built the tool company and where Hughes himself had been born. California pointed to years of residence and business activity in Los Angeles, where the aircraft company operated, and where Hughes had lived for decades during the Hollywood years. Nevada, where he had spent his final American years sealed inside a hotel room on the Las Vegas Strip, buying hundreds of millions of dollars in property, made its own claim. Each state wanted its share of the estate tax, and the amounts at stake were enormous. The Supreme Court of the United States would note, in its own published record, that if 2 of the 3 states had both collected their full claims, the combined marginal rate on the estate would have exceeded 100%. The heirs would have owed more than the fortune was worth. 3 trips to the Supreme Court were required to settle the dispute. The final agreements came in 1984. California collected about $150 million. Texas collected about $50 million, more than $200 million in state taxes alone, drawn from a fortune that had no trust to shelter it, no domicile plan to establish a single jurisdiction, and no legal barrier of any kind standing between the money and the taxing authorities. A trust would have solved it. A simple declaration of domicile would have narrowed it. Hughes had neither, and then the companies were sold, one by one, for whatever the market would pay at the time of each sale, because no one was in a position to run them, and no plan existed that said they should be kept together. The airline went in 1980 for $38.5 million. In 1984, the helicopter division sold for $470 million. The casinos were divested through the 1980s, each sold to operators who had no connection to the name above the door. And the last piece of the empire, a vast tract of undeveloped land on the western edge of Las Vegas called Summerlin, the land Hughes had bought with casino profits and held for a future he never planned, was settled in 2010 with a payment of $230 million. More than 3 decades after the death of the man who once owned every acre of it. 3.5 decades to dismantle what one man had spent a lifetime building. From the afternoon in 1976, when a chartered jet landed in Houston, carrying a body no one could recognize, to a real estate closing in 2010 for desert land that had been bought with casino profits in a decade when the buyer never left his hotel room. Every company sold, every contract surrendered, every acre transferred to someone else. Hundreds of millions of dollars consumed by state taxes and legal fees, because a man who controlled every detail of his life, down to the food he ate, and the light in his room could not bring himself to fill out one piece of paper that would have told the world what to do with his money when he was gone. And yet one piece survived. Of everything Howard Hughes built in his lifetime, one thing was not sold, not divided by the courts, not drained by the tax authorities, and not consumed by the legal fees that devoured the rest. It was, by most measures, the least promising thing he ever created. And it is the only thing that still stands. In 1953, Howard Hughes established the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. At the time, it looked like nothing at all. The organization started its life carrying $18 million of debt, and in its first full year of operation, it spent less than $45,000 on actual medical research. That is not a misprint. $45,000 from a man worth billions for the stated purpose of advancing medical science. Critics called it a tax shelter, a device Hughes had constructed to shield his aircraft company from federal taxation by housing it inside a charitable structure that existed on paper and almost nowhere else. The criticism was not without basis. The tax advantage was real, and Hughes was not a man who gave money away without a reason. But the structure was real, and the structure is what mattered. The Medical Institute, not Hughes and not his estate, owned the Hughes Aircraft Company outright. And because the institute was organized as a non-profit medical research body, the aircraft company's earnings flowed to it rather than to Hughes or to his personal fortune. That single fact changed everything. When Hughes died without a will in 1976, the aircraft company did not enter the probate fight. It did not pass to the cousins, did not fall to the 400 claimants, or the 200 lawyers, or the 3 competing state tax authorities. The aircraft company belonged to the Institute, and the Institute had a board of trustees, a charter, a governance structure, and a legal existence that did not depend on any single person being alive to keep it running. Of everything Howard Hughes owned, this was the one piece that had been built to survive his death. On the 20th of December, 1985, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute sold Hughes Aircraft to General Motors for $5.2 billion. That single transaction brought in more than twice the entire fortune Hughes had left behind at his death, for a company the critics had dismissed as nothing more than a front for a tax dodge. The proceeds went into the Institute's endowment, and the endowment grew. The Institute expanded its research mission across the country, funding laboratories, fellowships, and scientific programs at universities from coast to coast. Today, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute holds about $24 billion in assets and is one of the largest private funders of biomedical research on Earth. The structure that had started with debt and a pittance for research outlived the fortune it came from many times over. Howard Hughes left 2 things behind when he died. He left a fortune of about $2.5 billion with no will, no trust, and no plan for any of it. It was sold off piece by piece over 34 years until every company and every acre belonged to someone else. And he left a medical institute that sold a single holding for more than $5 billion and today holds about $24 billion. The fortune with no structure was carved up by strangers over 34 years. The structure that started with almost nothing outlived everything. A single page, signed before 2 witnesses, would have saved all of it. Howard Hughes never wrote it.